protest and survive. CD had intended to change his entire policy regarding his pursuit of Rachel, but he was not in a position to do so. Rachel liked the things that they'd been doing together just the way they were. The peace and ecology bit had really got in amongst her, and she wanted to get more involved. As far as she was concerned, CD was inexorably linked with her growing interest. That was what their relationship was based on, and she liked it that way. After all, she knew plenty of blokes to drink and play pool with, but there weren't many who would schlep 20k to a meeting about how much raw sewage was getting pumped into Perth's swimming waters. Aussie ads. Today's schlep was to a kind of protest bazaar at the naval installation 30 kilometres north of Carlton. For the previous 6 years, there had been a permanent women's protest encamped close to the public jetty, and this was a day of support. The US South Pacific Fleet was coming in, which was always an occasion for excitement, horror or indifference, according to individual attitudes on US fleets. So CD and Rachel arrived a little late and the party was in full swing. The hippies were painting children's faces, the police were pretending to be friendly, and a small group of strippers and hostesses were waving their boobs about. This was because the arrival of the fleet was a very special time for the clubs and strip joints of Perth and for Fremantle. The owners would send down their dancing girls to hang adverts off the quay and bare their breasts as the ships came in. Come to the 301 Club and see bonza Aussie tits, the signs would say. The girls jumped up and down, jiggling their bonza Aussie tits as a kind of foretaste of what the lucky sailors could expect if they visited one of the clubs. This, incidentally, is an example of classic Australian advertising. It tends to be abrupt and to the point. For instance, if a manufacturer has produced a sausage that he or she considers to be long and meaty, he will call the produce long and meaty saucies and advertise it thus. Long and meaty saucies. They're long and they're meaty. And they're saucies. Halfway to the printers with the advertising copy, the manufacturer will realise that he's not pointed out that the sausages are Australian. He will immediately rename them Long and Meaty Aussie Saucies and proudly boast, Long and Meaty Aussie Saucies. They're long and meaty and they're saucies. Pure Aussie. After some thought, he might add, eat 'em, just to make the situation absolutely clear. It makes a change from the sort of ad where a picture of a lizard on a pyramid basking in the sun is like supposed to make you desperate for a fag. The One World Festival. Anyway, the poor cold girls jiggled and the poor cold US sailors whooped and hollered from the decks of their ships, no doubt thinking that if the girls did this at the decks, what fabulous and exotic pleasures could be expected on paying $20 to get into a club. None, sadly. Just more tit jiggling, just minus the goosebumps. CD and Rachel arrived rather late. Look at those girls, said CD, looking. Pretty gross, eh? He added, looking some more. I mean, just totally out of order, he added, as he took another long, hard look, just to make sure that it really was as offensive as he thought it was. Rachel wasn't interested in the girls, gross or not. She was taking in the scene as a whole and experiencing a gutful of frustration and doubt. There, floating out on the high seas, was the US South Pacific Fleet, looking, it had to be admitted, pretty damn hard. On the dock, in opposition to this bay full of death tech, stood the protesters, looking, it could not be denied, rather pathetic. Balloons, painted children's faces, acoustic guitars. I mean, for God's sake, thought Rachel. Anyone faced by a battle fleet is going to feel a sharp sense of scale. It can only add to the inadequacy to be surrounded by street theatre and kids with T-shirts saying, "I want to grow up, not blow up." "I hate the way people always feel they have to justify their principles by linking them to their snotty kids," she said. Rachel didn't like kids very much. She found them selfish and demanding and socially inept. She certainly did not feel any need to lend substance to her hopes for a better world by harping mawkishly on the fate of the poor innocent kiddies. Well, as far as she was concerned, she was a poor innocent kiddie herself and would be until the day she died. It's so utterly yuck, banging your own ideas on the chest of some revolting little sprog. "We don't know what a kid wants anyway," she moaned to CD, who was eating a vegetable samosa from a stall. "Well, any one of these kids could be in the Navy itself in 15 years, she continued, warming to her theme. "I'm at this protest because I don't want to blow up. At least we know I haven't grown up to be an axe murderer, and this lot might. They're probably more likely to, actually. They reckon kids react against their parents' belief, and I'm not surprised," said Rachel, looking around at the hippie throng. "Wouldn't you turn into an axe murderer if your mother's idea of sweets was carrot cake?" "Don't be so hard on everybody all the time," said CD, who was enjoying his samosa and feeling benign. "These people are cool. It's not their fault they've got poor dress sense." Oh, sorry, I've got a hair just tickling my nose like it's crazy. "Jesus, will you look at that fella I just served?" said Rick the samosa maker. "What does he look like?" As it happened, CD believed himself to be affecting the casual elegance of an English dent abroad, strolling about on an early summer day. He was wearing a perfect linen suit and was the epitome of taste. Unfortunately, he didn't have a perfect linen suit, and certainly the old cricket trousers and chef's jacket were not an exact imitation. Rick and his live-in friend Judy were convinced that CD must be drug squad. "Oh, it's all so bloody pointless and dull," Rachel moaned. "Nobody's doing anything." "Well, what the hell are you doing?" asked CD, who was vaguely experimenting with the idea that it might turn Rachel on if he was more butch and dominant. He toyed with the thought of adding bitch, but mercifully reason prevailed. "Nothing," shouted Rachel. "And that's what makes me so angry. I'm not doing anything. I'm hanging around with a bunch of hippies, and hippies just bore me shitless." "Hippies bore everyone shitless, Rachel. It's their job," replied CD. "Hippies even bore hippies shitless. That's why they take so many drugs, just to avoid having to talk to each other. They say it's to change their heads, but it's not." "Well, it ought to be. If my head was as dull as that, I'd want to change it," said Rachel. CD and Rachel stood in silence. CD trying to think of something dominant to say, and Rachel reading a huge sign on one of the dock walls that said Perth Premium Gold, a regular drinking beer for a regular beer drinker. Anyone who scorns Australian copywriting would scorn no further if they could have seen the effect that this advert was having on Rachel. Her whole soul cried out for a beer. And then somebody began to sing Blowing in the Wind. "Right, that's it," she said. "I'm going to the pub." But just then there was a stirring in the crowd. Something interesting was happening on one of the ships. Rachel stayed to watch. The USS Enormous. The US Navy, in a monumentally optimistic bit of public relations, had opened up one of the warships to public inspection. the public of Carlo were to be allowed to take a look at the hardware to which they were hosts. What the thinking was behind the American decision is hard to say. Why people, nervous that their little town was being made into a prime nuclear target, should be less nervous for getting a closer look at the cause of their fears is a question not easily answered. And what you are standing on here, folks, is a United States warship. Yes, sirree. It's this little mother them Ruskies are going to be aiming at when they miss and hit your town. CD would have quite liked to have gone and had a look, though he wouldn't have admitted it. Actually, if he had have gone, he would have been rather bored. The US Navy did not intend to give much away. Second Lieutenant Kowalski was detailed to welcome the tourists aboard and escort them around those few sections of the ship that were not classified. He had been carefully chosen. Tall and splendid in his pure white uniform, he had an easy, open face and manner that made you just know he would defend democracy until his sabre broke. He dazzled his smitten audience of love-struck young women and death-mad little boys with a whirlwind of technology. This here is a U.S. Naval 8.2-liter unload and distribution facility, manually operated by a single crewman. Sorry, my American accents are quite terrible at the moment. Moving on from the toilet, the awestruck group were privileged to inspect an on-site perimeter confinement safety unit, or a ship's rail, and then it was here that the excitement Rachel had observed from the shore occurred. Through CD's second-hand binoculars, she could see that two men had somehow managed to detach themselves from the group of sightseers, and they were scaling one of the sort of conning tower affairs that these ships seem to bristle with. One stopped only a few feet up, but the other... The other was tremendously nimble. He almost seemed to be running vertically. If he'd been wearing a red and blue body stocking, Rachel would have thought it was Spider-Man. Well, having climbed up as far as he could go, a good 30 feet above the shouting sailors, he attached himself to a satellite dish, managing to almost sit in it as if he were about to be stir-fried in an enormous wok. He raised his fist in a triumphant salute towards the protesters on the shore and then unfurled a 25-foot-long banner that slashed about like a scythe in the strong wind. It was inscribed with the legend, "Nuclear Target." Well, that was by no means the end of the entertainment, for suddenly there was a flash and a bang and all the shouting sailors dived for cover. It took another 3 bangs before they realised that these were not SS-20s, but simply fireworks let off by the other man, who had not climbed so far, to draw attention to the protest. The sailors, furious for having been duped, soon hauled the firework fellow down, but it took 20 minutes for them to reach the one with the banner and bring him and his banner back to the deck. The protest was sufficiently dramatic for it to be shown on the news that evening. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it was also undeniably exciting. Watching from the shore, Rachel and CD did not know it, but this was their first encounter with Walter and Zimmerman. They were soon to become comrades in arms against Stark. New chapter. Zimmerman and Walter. Zimmerman's intense dislikes of weapons of war had come upon him quite suddenly, literally in a flash. One moment he was walking through the jungle, not decided on the subject either way, and the next moment his private parts were hanging off a nearby tree, and he knew he didn't like bombs. The doctors had done wonders. They fixed his legs, sewed his guts back together, but, sad to say, all the wonders of microsurgery could not get his tackle down out of that tree. A few months later, Gough Whitlam brought the Australian Army home, but it is said that for those who experienced the horrors, each one left a little piece of themselves out in Vietnam. In Zimmerman's case, It was his lunchbox. Ever since then, he'd never felt himself a whole member of society, and of course he wasn't, because And of course he wasn't, because he no longer had a whole member with which to be social. He'd not felt himself a part of what governments decided. He'd not felt himself bound by their rules. Basically, he hadn't felt himself. Why had Zimmerman joined up in the first place? It was a question he often asked himself while contemplating the wreckage that lay inside his trousers. He could remember things quite clearly up until when he was about 18. It was about then that he had dropped a couple of tabs of acid and gone to see John Wayne in the Green Berets. He remembered that. But from then on, it all got very confused. There were bangs and flashes and a series of very unpleasant experiences. Suddenly, it was 3 years later and he was being carried off an Army Medical Corps Hercules air transport. Sadly, minus his hand luggage. And since then, Zimmerman had learned that during the vague period of lights and bangs, he had turned into an exceptional soldier, eventually becoming a commando. The army, it seemed, had trained him to do unspeakably horrid things very well indeed. They trained him diligently, and his skills served them well. Zimmerman knew they had been pleased because they had given him a top combat medal, of which he was proud. Zim had been very popular with his comrades, and there was a good reason for this. They said he had guts. They were right, certainly. He had guts, and normally they were full of drugs, and this made him very amenable. And when someone was needed to creep down a suspicious-looking hole, a hole which probably contained half the Viet Cong army, the others would shuffle their feet self-consciously and look shyly at Zim. "Zim will do it," they would say to each other reassuringly. "Yeah, he's a real regular guy." By regular guy, they of course meant raving lunatic, but they were being tactful. When someone is stupid enough to risk his ass continually while others hide behind it, you let them. Sad to say, by the time Zim got back to Australia, his brain was fried. One thought was clear in his head, though. One thought had sustained him throughout the long years since Nam. Zimmerman was going to save the world. Well, that was what he was doing when he scaled the conning tower of the USS Enormous and unfurled his banner. He was saving the world. And he had been saving the world when he had broken into the tobacco company's laboratories and set all the dogs free. Certainly, the net result had been a bunch of beagles wandering around half-starved and desperate for a ciggy, but Zim never thought his actions through very clearly. He just wanted to save the world, which, seemed simple enough to him. Walter. It was lucky then that Zim's constant companion was Walter. A very together guy indeed. Extraordinarily together, considering he was a hippie, and hippies are not, on the whole, known for their togetherness. It was Walter who was with Zim on the USS Enormous, telling Zim to cool it as they were led away by the military police. Walter always knew when Zim was in danger of flying off the handle and exercising some of those terrible skills that the army had taken such pains to teach him. There were little telltale signs like veins bulging on his forehead, tiny codes in the things Zim would say like, "I'm going to kill the dickhead in the white uniform." Walter knew to pick up on these hints and act on them. Walter had a genuinely calming presence. When talking to him, one really did get the impression that things were all right. "Tell me things are all right, Walter." "They're all right." And somehow, for a little while at least, they were. Of course, after a while, Walter's cool would begin to irritate, because there are times in every person's life when they want to fly off the handle. If the car explodes, for instance, or you turn out to have an uncanny resemblance to an escaped psychopath and get wrongly sent to prison for 1,000 years, Walter's response to disasters like this would be to say, "It's okay, it's cool, just, try not to become uptight about it." And this, obviously, this could be pretty aggravating. But often, Walter's calm, almost spiritual demeanour was a comfort to those who met him. Not the judges or police officers and representatives of chemical waste disposal firms, obviously. Not the hire purchase people to whom Walter would patiently explain that money exists only in their heads, but most people. Well, some people found him calming. For a while, anyway. We needed to be calm to do the sort of things Walter was in the habit of doing. When you've sat in a tiny motorised dinghy with a shit-scared blue whale on one side of you, a seriously pissed-off whaling fleet on the other side, 10-foot waves beneath you, and an explosive harpoon sailing over your head, you either learn to be cool or you go through a lot of pairs of trousers. For Walter was green. He was as green as the contents of an Eskimo's hanky. He loved plants and animals and everything. And there was one plant that Walter particularly loved, although rolling it up and setting it on fire and sucking it to death was a funny way of showing it. Walter also had a selfish motive for his greenness. He firmly believed that peaceful coexistence with other life forms on the planet was the only way that the human race would survive. A lot of people took the piss out of the sort of things Walter did. "Oh, wow, man," they would say, "save the whale, yeah, and black lesbian disabled dwarves for a nuclear-free health food shop." In fact, both Rachel and CD had been guilty of this type of comment in their time. But Walter knew that these people were wankers. Whales are the largest creatures left living on Earth. The heart of a blue whale is higher than a tall man, and it weighs half a ton. The creature itself grows to 100 feet and weighs 160 tons. Everything pales in comparison to a creation of this awesome magnitude. What is the Taj Mahal or the Golden Gate Bridge to a living force with arteries so huge a child could crawl among them? Yet they were being wiped off the face of the earth to make soap. "Listen, man, would you unpick the Bayeux tapestry to get a reel of cotton?" Walter said at his trial. He got a $1,000 fine. Walter and Zimmerman. It was Walter who had turned Zim onto the echo stuff. He suggested to Zim that he needed to channel his energies. "Listen, man," Walter would say, "like, one day you're freeing beagles, the next you're riding the bus all night defending old ladies. I mean, cool, don't get me wrong, very cool. I just feel like we should, formalise our avenues of protest, right? Or does that sound a bit too much, like heavy fascist mind control, and pretty soon we'll be as bad as the people we're protesting against?" "Well, yeah, it does a bit, man," Zimmerman would reply. Nonetheless, despite the organisational pitfall of not wishing to get into any kind of fascist mind control thing, Walter and Zimmerman had sort of come to a conclusion as to what they were. They were green commandos. When they bothered to get up and were straight, Zim's horrifying military skills, combined with Walter's ability to keep them in check, made them quite a team. They had saved animals, destroyed logging equipment, blocked up chemical waste pipes, and once they even burnt down a factory full of polystyrene packing bobbles. The little action of flying the peace banner over the ship, that was just a minor diversion for them. Not so for Lieutenant Kowalski. Remember him? He was a crazy man. He had never felt so insulted in his life. After all, here was the US Navy extending the hand of friendship, and these two hippies had just put a turd in it. In fact, as the police escorted Walter and Zim from the ship, a lot of people involved with the peace protest shook their heads critically. They strongly disapproved of confrontation, especially if it involved law breaking. "That's just silly," they said. "Making people angry won't help." But Rachel felt it might help a bit more than painting C and D symbols on children's faces. New chapter. Bullens Creek. Sly was flying much farther north than Calgoocatta. He was heading up over the great sandy desert. It was in this vast area of almost empty wilderness that he had been asked to secure the land required for the astonishing and immoral project that he was now a part of. He felt then, as he had felt on the jumbo the morning after his dinner, that this was going to be a lot more difficult than his fellow conspirators thought. The land requirements for this project were very specific. Unfortunately, they were also very contradictory. The two main points, ranking above all other considerations, were firstly, that it had to be utterly remote, and secondly, that good communications were essential. Great, thought Sly. Most ingenious paradox. Stark requirements. The need for isolation, that was obvious. The less people knew about what was going on, the better. Mineral exploration and leisure development were to be the cover story, and they would do at a casual glance. However, if someone started delving deeper and the real purpose of the site was discovered, well, Sly just hoped he had a convenient top-floor window to jump out of. Secrecy was the key. Therefore, not only did the place have to be remote, but a contoured landscape was also considered essential. It is easier to undertake massive construction projects discreetly if you can hide behind a few hills. Also, an uneven terrain made electronic surveillance more difficult. And luckily, most of the US spy satellites were pointing at the Soviet Union. The Americans were unlikely to bother the team Sly was now a member of. After all, Americans like multimillionaires. Their whole scene was hassling commies. And Sly hoped so anyway, because if some overzealous underdog at the CIA or in the Pentagon did get onto them, no politico on earth would, or could, defend their actions. For the first time, they would not be able to buy themselves out of trouble. It was a salutary thought. Despite the enormous political clout that multimillionaires wielded, especially when organised in groups, so dark was their present purpose that were it to be revealed, even the most bent politicians in the world would be forced to turn and bite the hand that had fed it for so long. And this was why privacy was essential. As has been said, though, unfortunately, so were communications. The leisure cover story would not last long once things really got going, and when the consortium moved, it would have to be very fast indeed. Surprise would be the essence of success. If the world had more than a moment's warning, all might be lost. Hence, they had to be able to assemble the personnel, the technology, and the huge mass of hardware quickly. This could not be achieved with restricted access. Well, anyway, the upshot of it all was that they were not actually spoilt for choice as to locations. The optimum spot seemed to be an area west of a place called Bullens Creek. It was hilly-ish, which is about as hilly as it gets in Western Australia, and it was utterly isolated apart from one road to Bullens. Bullens Creek itself, on the other hand, had just about sufficient communications for Stark's purposes. It had been fully integrated into the telecom system 5 years previously. It was on the interstate highway and it had an airstrip. Also, it was only about 500 miles northwest of Perth, so what lines of communication there were would not be too stretched. Dullsville, WA. I'll just interject here. WA is the abbreviation for Western Australia. Dullsville, WA. After a long, dull flight, Sly landed at Bullens Creek Airport. Topol Bullen had been the first white man to find the creek back in 1867. If at the time he had entertained any hopes that one day a thriving metropolis would soon grow up about the place, thus ensuring him and his name a kind of immortality, he had had it. Bullens Creek had started off tiny and tedious and had gone downhill from there. Being the person after whom Bullens Creek was named is actually a slightly more anonymous thing than not having a place named after you at all. Even the people who live there have only half heard of it. Bullens Creek? Oh yeah, I think it's that tiny little town somewhere up towards the Territory. Come to think of it, buggered if I don't live there myself. Bullen himself never lived to discover that his name was to become a place that almost everybody in Australia had never heard of. He was killed by a camel whilst looking for his shorts, having had a dip in the creek he had just found. He had ridden the camel all the way from the coast and was under the impression that they'd become friends. Well, so had the camel, who was, therefore, rather surprised that on arriving at their first water for weeks, a meagre puddle dried almost completely in the appalling heat, Bullen had tethered it to a gum tree in order to get the first slurp. Bullen's reasons for doing so were actually very sound. Camels can suck up literally gallons of water in a matter of seconds, and Bullen, understandably, he wanted to get in quick before the camel drained the puddle. The camel did not realise this, however, and, thinking itself betrayed, broke its bindings and in an anger of thirst The camel did not realise this, however, and, thinking itself betrayed, broke its bindings in an anger of thirst and kicked Bullen out of the way, killing him in the process. In fact, for quite a while, the place was called Camel Kick Creek, but eventually Bullen's Creek prevailed, which is a shame because Camel Kick Creek is a much better name. The reason the name got changed was that there was a rather boring habit amongst the early white settlers of Australia. They liked to name the places after very dull Victorians. During the same period, people in the USA were giving places terrifically exciting names like Tombstone, Deadwood, Hangman's Tree, and Death Gulch. But the old Aussies preferred things less colourful. For instance, there lies, almost bang in the middle of Australia, one of the largest monoliths in the world. An unfractured mass of glorious red sandstone that rises 1.5 kilometres up from the flat desert floor and descends 4 kilometres beneath it. It has an astonishing, almost symmetrical shape, and according to the light, it changes colour from burning orange through fierce red to deep, cool purple. It is, of course, regarded with mystical awe by all who see it. The early Australians chose to call this wonder of the world Ayers Rock, after a dull Victorian administrator in a stupid hat, who happened to be the Chief Secretary of South Australia. We are, of course, talking of Uluru. It is, of course, a little unfair to make a comparison between Ayers Rock, Uluru, and Bullen's Creek. In fact, the name of Bullen's Creek was really rather apt because Bullen's Creek is very boring and Bullen had been a very boring man. Well, this was actually why he had set out to stride across the Great Gibson and the Great Sandy Desert in the first place. He'd got sick of people yawning at him when he talked about his theory. All the other explorers who set off on similar quests had great theories that people loved to listen to. fascinating stuff about vast inland seas or a continental-sized oasis full of lush vegetation, fabulous rivers and endless free sex. Well, Bullen's theory, on the other hand, was very dull indeed. He claimed that the vast hinterland of Australia was nothing but a dry, hot, flat desert with some dingoes and a few broken bits of rock. Well, he was right, of course, but it's still a very boring theory. And had he ever made it back, people would have still yawned at him. After all, the only thing more boring than being boring and being dull is being dull and correct. I botched that. Yes, the only thing more boring than being dull is being dull and right. Yes, I totally fucked it up. So anyway, even the camel that got him was bored. What a dull drink, it thought. And he sauntered off, becoming one of the earliest of the domestic camels imported into Australia to return to the wild. Today, of course, there are herds of wild camels in the deserts of Oz, but then it was quite a novelty. Certainly more interesting than Bullen's Creek, anyway. It was well over 100 years since the camel had killed Bullen, and that still ranked as the most exciting thing that had ever happened in the area. What people do for diversion in isolated country towns is a bit of a mystery all over the world, although the physical similarities, hair lips, low foreheads and high instance of mental disorder might go a little way to solving the mystery. It used to be said that the best way to stop a girl getting pregnant in Bullen's Creek was to castrate her brother. Goodness me. Things definitely improved after they put in the airstrip and metalled the roads, but once you've looked at the war memorial and said, "Oh Christ, it's hot," a couple of times, you're still a bit stuck for raucous amusement. One of the things they do in places like Bullen's Creek is form dinner clubs. Sly was aware of this country habit and was relying on it to provide him with a medium whereby to ingratiate himself with the white locals. He felt this would be a sensible preliminary to trying to negotiate with the Aboriginal community. Having parked his little plane, he strolled into the old shed, grandly titled the Airport Terminal, to get his paperwork sorted. Here, as he expected, he found a sign announcing all the regular events which the town was looking forward to. Royal Rotary Mouse, 2nd and 4th Mondays, venue, Queen Victoria Pub. Grand Order Mason Sheep Shearers, Wednesdays, venue, Queen Victoria Pub. Lion Club Elks, 1st and 3rd Thursdays, venue, Queen Victoria, well, you get the picture. The fun went on and on. Scanning the lists of officers, Sly was struck by the number of times each name occurred, but in a different post. For instance, John Timpkiss might be the treasurer of the Elks and the secretary of the Mouses, while Phil Barkle was the opposite. Either lots of people in Bullen's Creek had the same name, or else all the clubs had the same members. Well, the latter, of course, was the case. They could have just formed one big club, but of course that wouldn't have been any fun. The variety provided endless diversion. It was a job sometimes for a bloke to figure out which stupid hat he was supposed to be wearing that night. Sly knew that since he was probably the most prominent visitor to Bullen's Creek since the camel that got Bullen, he would be approached to address one of these institutions. Well, that was fine by him. And the sooner he started getting his story straight, the better. All right, we'll leave it there. And we will pick it up on the morrow with a new chapter, The Nerve Centre of Echo Action. All right. Thank you very much for joining me. I should be fine to go back to live streaming very soon, I hope. Just tweaking my setup in the face of some internet service changes. Alright, thank you very much for watching the video. Hit like if you like, hit the thumbs down if you didn't like, and leave me a comment or something, and you will see me next time. Love yous. Zeb out.